At the center of this tragic tale were two individuals whose paths had crossed years earlier, only to collide again with devastating consequences. David Reeves, a 32-year-old software engineer, and Cassandra Cassie Pitt, a 30-year-old marketing executive. They had once been lovers, their romance which had burned bright and fierce, ending in heartbreak and resentment. Neither could have imagined that a chance reconnection through a dating app would reignite a spark, not of love, but of deadly obsession. David Reeves was born on a sweltering summer day in 1991. From an early age, it was clear that David was gifted with an exceptional intellect. His parents, both academics at the University of Chicago, nurtured his curiosity and pushed him to excel in his studies. Growing up, David was surrounded by books and intellectual discourse. While this environment fostered his academic growth, it did little to develop his emotional intelligence or social skills. As a child, David often struggled to connect with his peers, finding solace instead in the logical world of mathematics and computer programming. At school, David's brilliance was evident, but so was his inability to navigate social situations. He was often the target of bullies, which only served to deepen his isolation and fuel a simmering resentment towards those he perceived as more socially adept. Despite these challenges, David's academic performance remained stellar, and he graduated as valedictorian of his high school class. His exceptional grades and test scores earned him a full scholarship to the Institute of Technology, where he pursued a degree in computer science. It was during his college years that David began to come out of his shell, albeit slowly. He joined the robotics club and found a group of like-minded individuals who appreciated his intellect and quirky sense of humor. After graduating from MIT, David landed a prestigious position at a tech startup. His innovative ideas and tireless work ethic quickly propelled him up the corporate ladder. By the age of 28, he was leading his own team of developers working on projects that promised to revolutionize the field of artificial intelligence. Despite his professional success, David's personal life remained a source of frustration and disappointment. His relationships were few and far between, often ending abruptly due to his intense nature and difficulty in expressing emotions. David's therapist, whom he began seeing in his late 20s, suggested that he might have undiagnosed high-functioning autism, which could explain his social struggles and intense focus on specific interests. As David entered his early 30s, he found himself increasingly lonely and unfulfilled. His parents, now retired and traveling the world, were largely absent from his life. Colleagues admired his brilliance, but kept their distance socially. It was in this state of emotional vulnerability that David would encounter Cassandra Pitt, setting in motion a chain of events that would forever alter the course of both their lives. Cassandra Pitt's story began in the bustling city of Atlanta, Georgia, where she was born in 1993 to Elaine, a high school English teacher, and Desmond, a civil rights attorney. The youngest of three children, Cassie grew up in a household that valued education, social justice, and self-expression. From an early age, Cassie exhibited a natural charisma and an ability to connect with people from all walks of life. Her infectious laugh and quick wit made her popular among her peers, while her sharp intellect and curiosity endeared her to her teachers. Cassie's childhood was marked by a sense of adventure and a desire to experience all that life had to offer. Despite her outgoing nature, Cassie harbored a deep-seated insecurity about living up to her family's expectations. Her older siblings, both high achievers in their respective fields of medicine and law, cast long shadows. Cassie's passion for communication led her to pursue a degree in marketing and public relations. College life suited Cassie perfectly, allowing her to expand her horizons and explore new ideas. It was during her junior year that Cassie first began to question her sexuality. A close friendship with her roommate Valerie blossomed into a romantic relationship, leading Cassie to identify as bisexual. While her family was supportive, this period of self-discovery was not without its challenges, as Cassie navigated the complexities of her identity in the face of societal expectations. After graduation, Cassie's drive and talent landed her a position at a prestigious marketing firm in Chicago. She threw herself into her work, quickly gaining a reputation as a creative problem solver and a skilled communicator. Her career flourished, and by the age of 28, she had been promoted to a senior executive position, overseeing major accounts for national brands. As she approached her 30th birthday, Cassie felt a sense of pride in her accomplishments and a gnawing sense that something was missing from her life. It was in this state of introspection that fate would bring David Reeves into her orbit, setting the stage for a relationship that would have far-reaching and ultimately tragic consequences. The paths of David Reeves and Cassandra Pitt first crossed on a chilly October evening at a tech industry networking event in downtown Chicago. David, there to represent his company's latest AI innovations, found himself drawn to the vibrant energy emanating from the marketing corner of the room. It was there that he first laid eyes on Cassie, who was captivating a small crowd with her animated description of a recent successful campaign. Intrigued by her eloquence and charm, David mustered the courage to approach Cassie after her presentation. Their initial conversation was a blend of awkward pauses and unexpected connections. Cassie was impressed by David's depth of knowledge and unique perspectives, while David was captivated by Cassie's ability to make complex concepts accessible and engaging. Exchanging contact information, they parted ways that evening with a sense of potential hanging in the air. Over the next few weeks, their communication evolved from sporadic professional emails to daily text exchanges filled with witty banter and shared interests. Their first date, a visit to the Art Institute of Chicago, was a study in contrasts. David's meticulous analysis of brushstrokes and historical context was balanced by Cassie's emotional responses to the art and her ability to weave narratives around each piece. Despite their different approaches, both found the experience enriching, and the spark between them grew stronger. As their relationship developed, David and Cassie seemed to complement each other in unexpected ways. Cassie drew David out of his shell, encouraging him to experience life beyond the confines of his work and routines. In turn, David's steadiness and intellectual depth provided Cassie with a sense of grounding she hadn't realized she was missing. However, as the initial glow of romance began to fade, the fundamental differences in their personalities became more pronounced. David's need for structure and predictability often clashed with Cassie's spontaneity and social nature. Arguments became more frequent, with David's difficulty in expressing emotions and Cassie's frustration with his perceived emotional distance, creating a widening rift between them. The breaking point came 8 months into their relationship, when Cassie was offered a promotion that would require extensive travel. David, unable to cope with the idea of long distance and change, retreated into himself. His behavior became increasingly possessive and demanding, attempting to control aspects of Cassie's life in a misguided effort to keep her close. Feeling suffocated and recognizing the unhealthy patterns in their relationship, Cassie made the difficult decision to end things. The breakup was messy and emotionally charged. David, unable to process the rejection, alternated between pleading for another chance and lashing out with hurtful accusations. In the aftermath, Cassie threw herself into her new role, using work as a buffer against the emotional fallout. David, on the other hand, spiraled into a deep depression, his work suffering as he obsessed over what went wrong and how he could win Cassie back. As weeks turned into months, their lives diverged. Cassie began to heal and move forward, while David remained stuck in a loop of anger, self-pity, and fantasies of reconciliation. Neither could have predicted that their paths would cross again, or the tragic consequences that would follow when they did. The 3 years following David and Cassie's breakup saw their lives take dramatically different trajectories. Cassie, embracing her new role and the opportunities it presented, threw herself into her work with renewed vigor. Her career flourished as she spearheaded innovative marketing campaigns that garnered industry recognition. She traveled extensively, broadening her horizons and forging new connections both professionally and personally. During this time, Cassie explored her identity further, engaging in a series of relationships that helped her better understand her needs and desires. She dated both men and women, each experience teaching her more about herself and what she truly wanted in a partner. Through therapy and self-reflection, Cassie worked on setting healthier boundaries and communicating her needs more effectively. David, in stark contrast, struggled to move past the breakup. His work, once his primary source of pride and fulfillment, began to suffer as he grappled with depression and obsessive thoughts about Cassie. Colleagues noticed his declining performance and erratic behavior, leading to a series of warnings from his superiors. In an attempt to fill the void left by Cassie, David tried dating again, but each attempt ended in disappointment. He found himself constantly comparing these women to Cassie, always finding them lacking. His therapist encouraged him to focus on personal growth and healing, but David's sessions often devolved into ruminations about his past relationship and fantasies of reconciliation. As time passed, David's obsession with Cassie didn't wane, but instead took on a darker tone. He began monitoring her social media accounts religiously, creating elaborate stories in his mind about her life and the reasons for their breakup. Unbeknownst to Cassie, David had started driving by her apartment and favorite haunts, always careful to remain undetected. Both David and Cassie continued to live their lives, occasionally crossing at local establishments. These brief, awkward encounters only served to fuel David's obsession and reinforce Cassie's decision to end the relationship. Neither could have foreseen how a simple swipe on a dating app would soon shatter the fragile peace of their separate lives. On a quiet Sunday evening in September, David found himself mindlessly scrolling through a popular dating app. His therapist had suggested he try to meet new people, but but David's heart wasn't in it. He was using the app when a familiar face caught his eye. There, smiling back at him from the screen, was Cassie. David's heart raced as he stared at her profile. The photos were recent, showing Cassie at various events and travels. Her bio was witty and confident, highlighting her love for adventure and passion for her work. Without hesitation, David swiped right. His mind was already spinning with possibilities. To his shock and elation, it was a match. Cassie had swiped right on him too, though her reasons were far different from David's. For Cassie, seeing David's profile had been a surprise, but she had swiped right out of a mixture of curiosity and a desire for closure. She hoped that enough time had passed for them to have a mature conversation and perhaps even forge a friendship. David wasted no time in sending a message. "Hey Cassie, long time no see." His casual tone belied the trembling of his hands as he typed. Cassie's response came the next day. "Hi David, this is a surprise. I'm doing well, thanks. How about you?" Their initial exchange was polite but guarded. David, interpreting Cassie's responses through the lens of his fantasies, saw signs of lingering affection where there were none. He quickly steered the conversation towards meeting up, suggesting they grab coffee to catch up properly. Cassie, sensing David's eagerness, felt a twinge of unease. She gently deflected, saying she was busy with work, but suggesting they could chat more on the app for now. Over the next few days, their conversations continued sporadically. David became increasingly bold, reminiscing about their past and hinting at his desire to rekindle their relationship. Cassie, growing uncomfortable with the direction of their chats, decided to be direct in a carefully worded message. Cassie explained that while she valued the good times they had shared, she wasn't interested in revisiting their romantic relationship. She expressed hope that they could be friends, but made it clear that anything more was off the table for David. Cassie's rejection was like a physical blow. All the progress he thought he had made in therapy crumbled in an instant as he read and reread her message. His sadness quickly turned to anger. The old feelings of betrayal and resentment resurfaced with a vengeance, setting in motion a chain of events that would end in tragedy. In the days following Cassie's rejection, David's mental state rapidly deteriorated. The carefully constructed facade of normalcy he had maintained over the past 3 years crumbled, revealing the depths of his obsession and instability. He called in sick to work, isolating himself in his apartment, which quickly became a reflection of his chaotic mind. He created elaborate timelines and conspiracy-style string boards, trying to piece together the real reason Cassie had rejected him. In his delusional state, David convinced himself that Cassie was being manipulated by others, that she couldn't possibly have rejected him of her own free will. His online behavior became increasingly erratic. David created multiple fake profiles on various social media platforms, using them to interact with Cassie and gather more information about her life. He spent hours analyzing her posts, likes, and comments, looking for hidden messages he believed were meant for him. David's obsession soon spilled over into the physical world. He began following Cassie, carefully documenting her daily routines, the places she frequented, and the people she interacted with. He was meticulous in his stalking, always staying just out of sight, convinced that if he could just understand her life fully, he would find the key to winning her back. As weeks passed, David's grip on reality continued to slip. He stopped attending therapy, convinced that his therapist was part of the conspiracy to keep him and Cassie apart. His personal hygiene and living conditions deteriorated, but he barely noticed, so consumed was he by his obsession. David's work suffered severely. When he did show up at the office, his behavior was erratic and his performance subpar. Concerned colleagues tried to reach out, but David pushed them away, growing paranoid that they too were working against him. It wasn't long before he was called into a meeting with HR and placed on indefinite leave pending a psychological evaluation. This professional setback only served to fuel David's delusions. With no job to distract him, he devoted all his time and energy to his obsession with Cassie. He convinced himself that if he could just talk to her face to face, he could make her understand that they were meant to be together. David's planning became more sinister. He purchased a gun through an illegal online marketplace, justifying it to himself as protection against the imagined forces keeping him and Cassie apart. He spent hours practicing what he would say to Cassie, rehearsing scenarios that always ended with her realizing her mistake and falling back into his arms. As his mental state deteriorated further, his fantasies took on a darker tone. He began to entertain thoughts of forcing Cassie to listen to him, of making her understand their connection by any means necessary. The line between love and obsession blurred completely in his mind, replaced by a singular, all-consuming need to possess Cassie. On a crisp autumn morning, David woke with a sense of clarity that had eluded him for weeks. He showered, shaved, and dressed with care, as if preparing for a long-awaited date. In his twisted mind, this was to be the day when everything would finally be set right. With the gun tucked into his waistband and a bouquet of roses in his hand, David set out to confront the object of his obsession, oblivious to the tragedy he was about to unleash. The morning of October 15th, Cassie began her day as she always did, with a brisk jog through the neighborhood followed by a cup of coffee on her balcony. She had no way of knowing that just a few blocks away, David Reeves was watching her through binoculars, waiting for the right moment to make his move. As Cassie prepared to leave for work, David made his way to her apartment building, his heart racing with anticipation, the weight of the gun at his waist a constant reminder of the power he now held. He positioned himself near the entrance, the bouquet of roses clutched tightly in his trembling hands. When Cassie emerged from the building, David called out her name. She froze, recognizing his voice instantly. As she turned to face him, a mix of surprise and fear flashed across her features. "David, what are you doing here?" David's rehearsed speech abandoned him at the sight of Cassie. Instead, he thrust the roses toward her, his words tumbling out in a desperate rush. "Cassie, please, we need to talk. I know you didn't mean what you said. We belong together." Cassie's initial shock quickly gave way to anger. She took a step back, her voice firm as she replied, "David, I meant every word. You need to leave." But David was beyond reason. He advanced toward Cassie, his free hand reaching for her arm. "You don't understand. They've been lying to you, manipulating you. I'm the only one who truly loves you." Cassie's training in self-defense kicked in. She twisted away from David's grasp, her voice rising as she shouted for help and called the police. The mention of the police shattered the last of David's delusions. In a fluid motion born of desperation, he pulled the gun from his waistband. The roses fell, forgotten, to the ground as he leveled the weapon at Cassie. Cassie's eyes widened in terror at the sight of the gun. She raised her hands in a pleading gesture, her voice shaking as she tried to reason with him. For a moment, David hesitated. A flicker of doubt crossed his face as he stared into Cassie's pleading eyes. But then he caught sight of her phone in her hand, the screen showing a half-dialed 911 call. Something snapped inside him. What happened next was a blur of motion and sound. David lunged forward, grabbing for the phone. Cassie resisted, struggling to break free. In the scuffle, a shot rang out, echoing through the quiet morning air. Time seemed to stand still as Cassie stumbled backward, a look of shock and disbelief on her face. She looked down at the spreading red stain on her blouse. David stood frozen, the gun still clutched in his shaking hand. The reality of what he had done crashed over him like a tidal wave as Cassie collapsed to the ground. Neighbors began to emerge from their homes, drawn by the sound of the gunshot. David, panicking, turned and fled, leaving behind the woman he claimed to love, bleeding on the sidewalk. In the distance, sirens began to wail, growing louder with each passing second. But for Cassie, lying on the cold concrete, those sirens would come too late. The tranquil morning was shattered by the arrival of police cars and ambulances, their sirens piercing the air as they converged on Cassie's house. Detective Alana Vasquez, a veteran of the police department's homicide unit, arrived on the scene within minutes of the first 911 call. As paramedics fought to save Cassie's life, Detective Vasquez began the painstaking process of piecing together the events of the morning. She cordoned off the area, preserving the crime scene for the forensics team. The discarded roses, the shell casing from the fired bullet, and the blood-stained concrete all told a partial story of the tragedy that had unfolded. Witnesses were quickly identified and separated for interviews. A resident of the building had been watering her plants on her balcony when she heard the commotion. She described seeing a man matching David's description fleeing the scene, providing the first solid lead in the case. As the forensics team combed the area for evidence, Detective Vasquez turned her attention to Cassie's background. A preliminary search of Cassie's phone, retrieved from the scene, revealed the recent interactions with David on the dating app. This discovery quickly established David as the prime suspect. The investigation expanded rapidly. Detectives were dispatched to David's apartment and workplace, while others began the process of tracing his movements in the days leading up to the shooting. His recent leave of absence from work and erratic behavior painted a picture of a man unraveling. Interviews with Cassie's friends and colleagues revealed the history between her and David, shedding light on the toxic nature of their past relationship and David's inability to move on. Each new piece of information added to the growing profile of David as a dangerous and unstable individual. The search for David quickly escalated into an intense manhunt. As dawn broke on the second day after the shooting, law enforcement agencies from across the state joined the effort, transforming the quiet suburb into a hive of police activity. As the manhunt entered its third day, a breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A homeless man reported seeing someone matching David's description entering an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. The tip was initially met with skepticism, but given the lack of other leads, Detective Vasquez decided to pursue it. A tactical team was assembled, and in the early hours of the morning, they moved in on the warehouse. The tension was palpable as they methodically cleared the building, the silence broken only by the crackle of their radios and the echo of their footsteps on the concrete floor. In a dramatic turn of events, David was found barely recognizable from the man in the widely circulated photos, disheveled, malnourished, and clearly in a state of mental distress. He offered no resistance as he was taken into custody. Detective Vasquez, bleary-eyed but determined, conducted the initial interrogation. David, still in a state of shock, alternated between periods of eerie calm and emotional outbursts. His ramblings about conspiracies and his delusional belief that he and Cassie were meant to be together painted a disturbing picture of his mental state. Within hours of his arrest, David was assigned a public defender. She immediately requested a psychological evaluation, setting the stage for what would become a central issue in the case: David's mental competency to stand trial. As the legal proceedings unfolded, a team of forensic psychiatrists began the arduous task of evaluating David's mental state. Their findings would be crucial in determining whether he would face trial or be remanded to a psychiatric facility. Meanwhile, the prosecution meticulously gathered evidence from David's apartment, including the walls covered with photos and timelines of Cassie's life. His internet search history revealed a disturbing pattern of stalking behavior and research on untraceable weapons. Pre-trial motions flew back and forth. The defense sought to suppress evidence from David's apartment, arguing it was obtained without a proper warrant. The prosecution fought to include David's dating app conversations with Cassie as evidence of premeditation. The verdict in the trial of David Reeves sent shockwaves through the community. Found guilty of first-degree murder but mentally ill, David was sentenced to life in a high-security psychiatric facility, with the possibility of transfer to prison if his mental state improved. In the wake of the trial, the community struggled to heal. The case had exposed the vulnerabilities that existed even in their seemingly idyllic suburb, leading to increased awareness about stalking and domestic violence.